Before you immerse yourself in tonight's terror, hit that subscribe button if you think you can handle even darker stories lurking in the shadows. So, here's the thing. I was in a real pinch. A teacher out of a job due to budget cuts. It was brutal, honestly. You know how it is when you work in education, but one day, your position just gets axed because the school can't afford you anymore. It's like your whole world just slips away and leaves you scrambling. Bills piled up, and I was running out of options. That's when I got the call. It was a private school, not one I'd ever heard of, but they were looking for a substitute. They offered me double the pay for a single night. The catch? Well, they said the students were a little gifted, but challenging. They mentioned something about needing a teacher who could handle that, and honestly, I didn't care. I was desperate. I agreed, thinking I'd deal with whatever was thrown my way, just for one night. The school rep, a man with this strange, almost too calm demeanor, laid out the rules for me. 5 rules, he said, just for my safety. I wasn't in a position to argue, so I wrote them down. Rule 1. Take attendance at 8 p.m. sharp. If a name is called and no one responds, skip it. Do not call the name again. Rule 2. If a student asks to leave the classroom, tell them, you can't, it's not safe. Rule 3. Keep all classroom doors open between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Rule 4. If you hear scratching on the chalkboard, turn away. Do not look until it stops. Rule 5. Never look at the windows after midnight. If you do, keep looking until the reflection moves. I won't lie, I thought some of these rules were a little off, but I chalked it up to the school's eccentric nature. I needed the money, and hey, it would be a quick night. Nothing to worry about, right? Anyway, I showed up at the school, and it looked just like any other private institution. Clean, a little too polished, but nothing out of the ordinary. The lights flickered as I walked in, which was odd, but I figured it was nothing. They led me to the classroom, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was quiet, too quiet. The hallway seemed empty, no one else around. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. I had to get through the night. I glanced at the clock, 7:45, not too long before I had to start the attendance. As I looked around the empty hallways, I couldn't help but wonder why the classes were scheduled at night. After all, no school I knew of operated at this hour. But then, I figured maybe it was just a specialty thing, something to accommodate students with unusual schedules, or maybe even kids with unique talents who needed a more flexible environment to thrive. It made sense in a way, even if it was a bit strange. The bell rang at exactly 8 p.m., one of those sharp, almost mechanical sounds that always gets your attention. I pulled myself together, cleared my throat, and opened the attendance sheet. The classroom was still quiet, too quiet. No students had arrived yet, which I thought was odd. I had arrived early, but still, the first day of anything usually comes with a little hustle and bustle, right? I glanced out the window, half expecting to see students milling around outside. Nothing. Not a soul. I shook it off. They were probably just running late. It was a small school, so I figured maybe their schedules were a bit more relaxed. I focused on the task at hand. All right, I muttered to myself as I scanned the list. Time to get this over with. I started calling names, my voice echoing in the empty classroom. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. John, Sarah, Emily. Then I came across the last name on the list, William Prescott. For a moment there was complete silence. I looked up from the sheet, expecting to see a student shuffle into the room, but there was nothing. The name just hung there in the air, and something about it felt off. My gaze lingered a second longer than it should have. It felt like I was waiting for something, like I was supposed to hear a response, or maybe even a sound, but there was nothing. I remembered the rule. If a name is called and no one responds, skip it. Do not call the name again. I quickly moved on. Lily Thomas. But then, as I was starting to call out the next name, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a scraping. I froze, trying to place it. It was like a chair. No, it was a chair moving. The screeching noise echoed through the room, loud and jarring, cutting through the silence in a way that made my spine tingle. I turned my head slowly, my heart starting to race. The desk in front of me, directly across from where I stood, was empty, but the chair had moved. It had slid out from under the desk, like someone had pulled it out to sit. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Had I missed someone sneaking in? A chill ran down my back, but I didn't want to let myself get freaked out over nothing. I must have just misheard it. Maybe one of the other desks had shifted, and it only felt like it came from that desk. That seemed logical, right? But then I heard it, a whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. "You forgot me." I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and for a second I couldn't move. It wasn't like any whisper I'd ever heard. It wasn't the normal sound of students chatting or murmuring to each other. This was a voice that seemed to come from nowhere, and yet it was so close. My hand trembled as I held the attendance sheet, suddenly unsure of what to do. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. The room was still empty. The chair, however, was still pulled out. The desk was still empty. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, but I pushed it down. No, I was here to do a job. Just stick to the rules. I wasn't going to let myself get spooked. I stared at the empty desk for a moment longer, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the situation. But when nothing happened, I exhaled deeply and forced myself to keep going. I quickly moved on, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my gut. Jenna? Michael? But even as I called out the next names, I couldn't stop glancing back at the desk. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair still wasn't supposed to be pulled out like that. I couldn't explain it. I followed the rules like I'd been told. I moved to open all the classroom doors. The hallways beyond seemed darker than I remembered. I glanced down the corridor, but everything appeared still. The sound of my footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence as I moved between the rooms, each door creaking open with a groan. I had to remind myself to keep calm. It was just part of the job, right? As I opened the last door, I heard something. Whispers. At first, I thought they were just the usual hum of distant conversations from other classrooms, but the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't in English. It was a language I didn't recognize, soft and fast, like a chant or a hurried conversation. My stomach tightened. I stood still for a moment, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. Curiosity tugged at me. I couldn't just stand there, right? I had to see what was going on. I slowly crept towards the doorway to the room next door, my hand gripping the frame for balance. Peeking through the crack, I squinted into the dim light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as I focused, I saw them. Figures. Not students, not really. They were shadows, for lack of a better word. They looked like people, but not exactly. They were tall and thin, their outlines fuzzy and indistinct, like they were made of smoke or mist. Some appeared to be walking between the desks, but they didn't quite move like people. It was like they were glitching, flickering in and out of focus, like a corrupted video feed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures didn't seem to notice me. They just moved in slow, jerky patterns, like they were following some invisible schedule of their own. Their movements weren't smooth. They jerked and skipped, and the air around them seemed to distort, like static on a TV screen. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was something about them, something that pulled me in, made me want to understand what I was seeing. Were they students? Were they part of some strange new lesson plan? I didn't know, but I knew they weren't normal. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching them flicker in and out of existence, until the whispers grew louder, and I couldn't make out any more of the words. It was like the sound itself was warping, twisting into something incomprehensible. I had to get back to my classroom. This wasn't right. I backed away from the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to myself. As I turned to leave, one of the shadowy figures turned, and for a split second, its blurry, featureless face seemed to lock eyes with mine. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly shut the door behind me, my breath shallow, and leaned against it, trying to steady myself. What was going on in this school? The hallways were quiet again, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone was still watching me. When I returned to the classroom, I was startled to find several students sitting at their desks, as if they had always been there. I hadn't seen or heard anyone walk past me in the hallway, but now they were all seated, quietly looking at me. It was like they had materialized out of thin air. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should say something, but they just sat there, their faces blank and unreadable. I cleared my throat and stepped inside. "All right, let's get back to it," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. The students didn't respond, but I tried to focus on keeping things normal. After all, I was supposed to be in charge here, wasn't I? As I moved to the desk at the front of the room, I heard the faint, deliberate sound of a pencil scratching against paper. I glanced up and saw one of the students, a girl sitting at the back, hunched over her desk. Her shoulders were stiff and her head was tilted down, her hand furiously scribbling something. "Hey," I called out gently, "what are you working on?" She didn't answer. As I approached, I noticed her hand was moving faster than seemed possible, the pencil a blur against the surface of the desk. My stomach twisted when I saw what she was doing. She wasn't writing. She was carving symbols directly into the wood of the desk. "Stop," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're going to ruin the desk." When I got closer, I froze. The symbols on the desk were spreading, like ink bleeding onto paper. They expanded across the desk and onto the floor, black tendrils creeping up the walls as if they had a life of their own. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a dim, eerie light before flickering and disappearing altogether, leaving no trace behind. The girl finally looked up at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or something deeper. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's all part of you," she said, her tone calm but unsettling. "Don't you recognize it?" I took a step back, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. Before I could press her further, the bell rang, a soft, distorted sound that didn't seem to come from any direction in particular. When I looked back at the girl, her desk was spotless, as if nothing had happened. The symbols were gone, and she was sitting quietly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. I glanced around the room at the other students, hoping for some sign that they had noticed what just happened. But they were all sitting silently, their eyes focused on their desks. It was as if they hadn't seen anything at all. I tried to shake off the unsettling encounter with the girl and the symbols. After the bell, the students' behavior returned to normal, or at least what I assumed was normal for them. They sat quietly, occasionally fidgeting or whispering to one another, but something about their actions started to gnaw at me. It began with a boy sitting near the window. He was pulling at the sleeves of his sweater, over and over, his fingers tugging at the cuffs until the fabric stretched. It wasn't unusual behavior for a student, but the way he did it, so methodical, so precise, felt uncomfortably familiar. That's when it hit me. I did that. Whenever I was nervous or overwhelmed, I'd tug at my sleeves the exact same way, as if grounding myself in the texture of the fabric would calm my racing thoughts. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but then I noticed another student. A girl near the front was scribbling furiously in a notebook, her head bowed low over the pages. Her lips moved as she muttered softly, her words too faint to make out at first. I stepped closer, pretending to check on her, and caught snippets of what she was saying. "Why can't I get it right? This doesn't make sense. Stupid, stupid." The words sent a chill down my spine. That was my voice, or at least, it could have been. I'd said those same things to myself more times than I could count, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, struggling with lesson plans or worrying about how I'd pay rent. Hearing those self-critical whispers coming from someone else felt like staring into a mirror I didn't want to face. And then there was the humming. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder as the minutes passed. The melody was simple, repetitive, and achingly familiar. I turned toward the sound and saw a boy at the back of the room, his head resting on his desk as he hummed the tune. It was a lullaby, one I hadn't heard in years. My grandmother used to hum it to me when I was a child, back when the world felt safe and bedtime wasn't just a prelude to restless nights. My chest tightened. How did he know that song? It wasn't something you'd hear on the radio or even in a nursery rhyme book. It was just something my grandmother made up, or so I'd always thought. The boy looked up and met my gaze, his expression blank but his humming unwavering. I felt my pulse quicken. "Where did you learn that song?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just kept humming, his eyes locked on mine. The sound filled the room, growing louder in my ears until it felt like it was reverberating inside my skull. "Stop," I said, louder this time. "Stop humming." The boy blinked, his expression finally shifting to something like confusion. The humming ceased, and the room fell silent again. I exhaled, feeling like I'd just run a marathon. I looked around at the other students, searching for any sign that they'd noticed what just happened. But they all seemed absorbed in their own little worlds. The boy lowered his head back onto his desk, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. I returned to the front of the room, my thoughts racing. What was going on here? The students weren't just mimicking random behaviors. They were reflecting pieces of me. My habits, my thoughts, my memories. It was like the room itself was holding up a mirror, but instead of showing my reflection, it was fracturing it and scattering the pieces among the students. I glanced at the clock. Midnight was creeping closer, and I still had no idea what this school was or what I was supposed to be teaching here. The rules I'd been given echoed in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The clock struck midnight, and the classroom seemed to shudder with a cold, oppressive stillness. My focus had been on the students, who were either still or preoccupied with their odd, quiet behaviors. I told myself to avoid the windows. I didn't want to know what might happen if I broke that rule. But as I moved past the desk to check the time again, my eyes accidentally caught my reflection in the window. It wasn't just a fleeting glance. I saw myself staring back. Or at least, it looked like me. Something about it was wrong. My reflection wasn't neutral or tired, as I felt. It was smiling. Slowly, unnervingly. My chest tightened, and I froze. I couldn't look away now. I didn't dare. The rule echoed in my mind like a warning siren. If you do, keep looking until the reflection moves. I took a shaky breath, locking eyes with the image in the glass. My reflection mirrored my posture and gestures, at first. Then it did something I hadn't. It brushed its hair back from its face, a deliberate, almost mocking movement. I forced myself to stay calm. It's just a trick of the mind, I thought. Just a trick. But the reflection kept smiling, its expression growing wider, more unsettling. My hands, clammy and trembling, stayed at my sides, but the reflection's hands lifted as if pressing against the glass. I wanted to scream, to look away, but I couldn't. My breath came in short gasps as I waited, desperate for it to move in a way that would release me. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the reflection tilted its head unnaturally to one side. Then, as if the glass surface had turned to liquid, it melted away, dissolving into nothingness. The window was empty now, showing only the faint outline of desks behind me. My knees wobbled, and I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself, gasping for air. My reflection had moved. I had followed the rule. But something about the classroom felt different now, like the air itself had shifted. The students were still there, but their heads were all up now, their eyes fixed on me. None of them said a word. The clock ticked forward, and I realized how tightly I was gripping the desk. I forced myself to straighten, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Whatever had just happened, I wasn't about to let my guard down again. The evening passed slowly, each hour dragging on like the ticking of a clock in a distant, forgotten room. I was starting to feel the weight of the rules pressing down on me, every second a reminder that I was only a guest in this strange place. But it wasn't just the rules that kept me on edge. As I watched the students move through the room, their odd behaviors now felt like something more. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the pressure of the night getting to me, but the longer I observed, the more the patterns became undeniable. The anxious boy, always pulling at his sweater sleeves, was a mirror image of my own nervous habits, the ones I'd developed over the years, especially when I was under stress. I could feel the tension in my own hands, like they were itching to do the same. And then there was the apologetic girl who scribbled furiously in her notebook. She muttered self-critical thoughts under her breath, just like I used to do. I couldn't help but wonder, was she expressing all the guilt I had buried from my past mistakes? Guilt I never fully confronted? The quiet student humming that lullaby, why did it seem so familiar? The soft melody, one I hadn't heard in years, was from my childhood. I had hummed it to myself as a child when the world felt too big, when loneliness crept in from the corners of my life. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I'd longed for that comfort, even as an adult. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how I tried to ignore it, the connections were too clear. The students weren't just acting strangely, they were pieces of me. Then I found the yearbook. I had been looking for something to take my mind off the growing sense of dread, and I stumbled into the teacher's lounge, hoping to find a reprieve. But instead, I found something far worse. The yearbook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. As I flipped through, I saw faces that should have been unfamiliar to me, substitute teachers. But as I turned the pages, the unease in my stomach grew. The faces were too familiar. They were me. I stopped at a page showing a smiling woman, dressed in a teacher's outfit I didn't recognize, standing in front of a group of students. She was labeled as another substitute teacher, but something about her expression, it was my own. The same tired eyes, the same forced smile that didn't quite reach her lips. Flipping through the pages, I saw more of the same. Every teacher, every substitute, each one looked like me, but they were all just slightly different, as though they were versions of myself, each one more worn than the last. Each one had faded into the background, leaving only these hollow remnants behind. And then I came to the last page. There, in the center, was a photo of me. My face stared back at me with an expression I didn't recognize. I froze. The caption beneath it read, "In progress." I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to echo through my mind, ringing louder than anything I'd heard all night. I felt the world around me tremble, as if everything was starting to shift. The students, those strange fragmented versions of myself, weren't real. They were pieces of my subconscious, extracted and manipulated by this school. They were never meant to be here, just like I wasn't. I was just another iteration, another fragment in a long line of substitutes. And soon I realized I would be gone too, just like the others. The realization hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by it. What did it mean for me? What would become of me? Was I just a part of a never-ending cycle, doomed to repeat this night forever? The bell rang, cutting through the silence. I turned to face the classroom, the students still staring at me, their eyes void of any real human connection. The weight of the truth pressed down on me. I wasn't just teaching them, I was becoming them. And soon I would vanish. I stood frozen, heart racing, as the students slowly turned to face me. Their features, once different and distinct, began to shift. It started subtly, a slight change in the angle of their eyes, the curve of their lips, until they were no longer strangers at all. They looked like me. My own face, reflected in their expressions, contorted with fear and confusion. One of them, the girl who had been humming that lullaby, walked up to me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My body felt as though it had been tethered to the floor, paralyzed by a force I couldn't understand. She leaned in close, her voice a breathy whisper. "You'll be complete soon." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I understood. The school, it was breaking me down, piece by piece. Every moment I spent in its halls, I was losing more of myself. The students were fragments of me, but they were becoming the whole. I was just a part of a cycle, a broken version of who I once was. If I stayed any longer, there would be nothing left. I'd become just another hollow figure, wandering its endless halls forever. Panic surged through me, but I could barely move, my body feeling like it was made of stone. I had to leave. Somehow I found the strength to push myself away from the students. I turned and bolted toward the door, but the weight of the building seemed to press in from all sides, as if trying to swallow me whole. I ran through the hallways, my feet pounding against the cold floor, until I finally emerged outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I stumbled, gasping for breath. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The school loomed behind me, silent and imposing, its dark windows staring down at me like an unblinking eye. I had no memory of how I got outside, how I'd escaped. It was as though I had simply been released, had my body on autopilot. In my hand, I found the yearbook. It was now completely blank, the pages empty, save for one. The last page had a single sentence written in dark ink, "We'll see you again." I shuddered, the words creeping into my mind like a poison. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I tried to forget, but something had changed inside me. Small things at first. I lost my train of thought more often, as if my mind was slipping through my fingers. I heard faint whispers when I was alone, soft voices calling my name, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. And worst of all, it felt as though parts of me were missing. Not just memories, but pieces of my very being. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it deep inside me, the emptiness. The school had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I left the school, but I don't think it ever stopped taking from me. Thanks for watching. If you're craving more spine-chilling stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more nightmares.